What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and after week one of the NFL season, it seems like there's a lot of panic spreading around the fantasy community. We had a lot of big name players, highly drafted guys who kind of flopped in week one. They had bad performances, and so I'm going to go through a lot of these underperforming players, talk about whether or not we should actually be panicking on them, or if it was just a bad week and these guys are going to bounce back. If I don't mention a player you guys are interested in, you can always just comment the name down below, and I'll make sure to give you guys my thoughts. Any other questions, drop them down below. But let's dive right into some of these players and just gauge, what level of panic we should have on them. And I do kind of want to start off with the tight end position because the tight end position as a whole did not have a great look in week one. It was a position where I think there was a lot of depth heading into the year. That didn't look great in week one. So I want to start off here with Mark Andrews. And it seemed like in terms of like the top fantasy storyline, after Thursday Night Football, it had to be the Ravens tight ends because you had Isaiah Likely go out. He played more than expected. And not only did he play a lot of snaps, run a lot of routes, he absolutely dominated, was the tight end one on the week by far. And then you had Mark Andrews, who was a pretty highly drafted option, round 4, round 5. He was targeted twice, caught both of those for 14 yards. So very underwhelming here out of Mark Andrews. I'm not full-blown panicking, though, but I'll also acknowledge it's definitely not ideal. He had a 75% route participation, which is fine, but it definitely is a dip from last year. In the 10 healthy games he played last year, he actually never dropped below an 80% route participation. So some level of concern, I think, is fair. Andrews historically has not played well against the Chiefs. He was doubled heavily in that specific matchup. I don't know if teams are going to be able to do that moving forward, if Isaiah Likely can beat you the way he did against the Chiefs. I think the issue here long-term for Mark Andrews, though, is that I think his upside is very capped. He may very well still be the tight end one on this team. I would have him ranked over Isaiah Likely in terms of my rest of season rankings, but I was drafting Mark Andrews like as my tight end 4. That's where I had him ranked in there with Kelsey, Laporta, Trey McBride. I just don't know if he has that legit tight end one upside anymore. In kind of a split here with Isaiah Likely, you're hoping he was like the number one target in a boom year. Now you have 3 guys that are very involved with Andrews, Flowers, Isaiah Likely. So I don't think he's in contention for that tight end 1 overall spot. But if you drafted him, I'm guessing you didn't draft a stud tight end 2. I think he's definitely still playable as like your starting option, but you're definitely not feeling great about him after week 1. Also at the tight end position, we have Dalton Kincaid, and he was someone who had a lot of hype heading into this season. Week 1, he catches 1 pass for 11 yards. His usage was solid, had an 83% route participation. I guess my concern here with Kincaid is that he does not have the same proven track record of some of the other tight ends that were drafted around him. Those top guys that I mentioned, Kelsey, Laporta, Andrews, those are all proven entities at the tight end position. Trey McBride, even though he's, a younger option, he averaged 15 points per game once he became a starter last year. So we've already seen that breakout with him. Even a dude like Kyle Pitts, who was, typically drafted like right after Dalton Kincaid, even though he hadn't been great for fantasy, he still was, a proven option in year 1, had the second most receiving yards for a rookie tight end of all time. Dalton Kincaid had a fine rookie year, but his ADP was definitely pushed up because of his situation, the upside of potentially being Josh Allen's number 1 target. So it would have been nice if in week 1, we saw him start to have this year 2 breakout, be a focal point of the offense. We didn't get that. I'm not overly worried here. I'm not panicking. If you drafted him, you had the confidence in him as a player. So I'm not freaking out. It just would have been nice if we saw a little more here in week 1, but obviously still playable as like a starting tight end. And then the third tight end I want to talk about here, we could have gone in on like Kelsey, McBride, all those dudes. I think they're all going to be fine. I did kind of want to mention Evan Engram here. I haven't been overly high on Engram. I know some people really liked him. They thought he was being underdrafted this season. In my opinion, this week 1 wasn't shocking. Like I thought he'd do better than 1 reception for 5 yards, but I don't think we should have been expecting what we saw towards the end of last year. The one concerning part was that he had a 76% route participation. That is a big fall off from his 97% last year. So that's a little bit worrying. I do just think the part that people missed about Evan Engram heading into this year is that Evan Engram does not have a ceiling if Christian Kirk is in the lineup. In the 6 games last season without Christian Kirk, Evan Engram was a monster. 19.3 PPR points per game. In the 11 games with Christian Kirk, he was at 10.3 points per game. So I think he's more of like a back-end tight end 1 with Christian Kirk in the lineup. Still playable, but I don't think you should be expecting like this high ceiling option that we were getting towards the end of last year. So that's the tight end position. pretty much the entire position flopped. If you drafted a highly touted dude, I wouldn't be freaking out too much, but a little bit worried for some of those dudes. Now, looking at the wide receiver position, just want to touch on Amon-Ra St. here off the top. 3 receptions, 13 yards. I have zero concern for him. He's a stud. He's been a fantasy monster over the last couple of seasons. Has mid to high end wide receiver 1 upside, 100% route participation. His role has not changed. Literally zero concern with Amon-Ra St. Sometimes these top wide receivers just have a dud game. He just happened to have one of his in week 1. The next wide receiver here, Drake London, he was targeted 3 times, caught 2 of them for 15 yards. And the tough thing here with Drake London is that I have no concerns about him as a player or really the usage. I mean, he had 100% route participation. We know he's talented. The issue with Drake London, and what has been the issue his entire career, is that the quarterback play has not been good. So he's shown that he's a very good wide receiver, rookie year, year 2. He just didn't have the quarterback play. The reason why he was being drafted, fairly high as like a back-end wide receiver 1, high-end wide receiver 2 heading into this season, was that we finally thought he was getting that top quarterback play. Cousins was supposed to come in and elevate the ceilings of Drake London, also his teammate Kyle Pitts, but he looked really rough in week 1, and based on the Falcons' play calling and just, watching Kirk Cousins, it seems like he is still very, very limited from that torn Achilles injury. I guess the positive here for Drake London would be that even if Kirk isn't great, you still have Michael Penix waiting in the wings who could give you, solid quarterback play if Kirk doesn't turn it around. But the expectation coming in was that he was finally going to get like top quarterback play, someone who could really support him. And so the fact that that is up in the air at this point, there is room for some concern. You're just kind of hoping that Kirk Cousins can figure it out, or Michael Penix comes in and plays well as a rookie. So I do think it's fair to panic a little bit. I'm not like selling totally low on him because I don't think anyone's going to overpay at this point. But like if I was, drafting my team today, I probably would not have Drake London ranked as high as I did heading into week 1, just because that quarterback position does seem like it's a little bit up in the air. The next wide receiver that was kind of drafted right around Drake London, kind of leading that tier after like the top, I think 8 or 9 consensus wide receivers, it's Marvin Harrison Jr. He was targeted 3 times, caught 1 of them for 3 yards. And I'll just be honest, my panic level here is pretty low for Marv. It was his first NFL game. The expectations were so high because his ADP was so high. We hadn't seen a rookie wide receiver get drafted a high in fantasy, like literally ever. And it's obviously because he was a great prospect, but it was also just due to the overall state of the wide receiver position, where outside that consensus top 8, you had just not a lot of consensus, like those back end wide receiver 1s through the wide receiver 2s. It felt like a very, very flat tier. And I mean, a lot of those dudes that were drafted within this tier, I'm talking about in this video, like Drake London was in there. You had a guy like Chris Olave, who I'm going to talk about in a little bit. Even Brandon Ayuk, who I'm not talking about in this video, but he was kind of also thrown in there. So I think the expectations were obviously high. And I was expecting a better game here, but I'm not worried. He's a super talented player. Kyler has supported, his wide receiver 1s, Hollywood Brown, DeAndre Hopkins, different seasons, different situations. So I think Marvin Harrison Jr. is going to bounce back. I'm not freaking out here. The wide receiver I just mentioned, Chris Olave, he was targeted twice, caught 2 of them for 11 yards. And I will say my panic for Chris Olave is pretty much non-existent. I think the main concern for Olave heading into this season was just the overall ceiling of this offense, the quarterback play. Like, could Derek Carr and the Saints offense actually support a fantasy wide receiver 1? Because the talent is there for Chris Olave. It's just that could the situation elevate him to be like a top 12, a top 10 option? And the fact that the offense and Derek Carr looked really good in week 1, I think that's pretty encouraging. I think it's a good sign for Chris Olave, and I think he's going to be a nice option moving forward. Now, the next, group of wide receivers, it's going to be all 3 of the Bears wide receivers. DJ Moore, Keenan Allen, and Rome Odunze. This entire Bears offense flopped. I'll also be talking about DeAndre Swift and Caleb Williams later on in this video. I really have no panic when it comes to DJ Moore. He looks like their wide receiver 1. I have confidence that Caleb is going to continue to improve moving forward. I think he'll be fine. I think DJ Moore will be fine. For Keenan Allen, I will say I'm a little bit more concerned. This actually could have been a pretty decent game out of Keenan Allen. He dropped a pretty perfect touchdown pass. Then he got open deep. Caleb missed him. So there were definitely some opportunities where this could have turned into a pretty strong performance out of Keenan Allen. It just didn't happen. I was already a little bit lower on him, coming into the year. And I think I still do and kind of did view him as more of like an early season play where he's going to be a top 2 wide receiver in snaps to start off the year. And then I think that Rome Odunze, I thought, and I still do think that Rome Odunze is probably going to overtake him at some point in the season. So the issue here with Keenan Allen is that if Caleb Williams is struggling early on, doesn't have it put together right away, I think that's just going to limit the upside we're getting out of him early on. But I still think Rome Odunze probably has the upside to overtake him, throughout the rest of the season. So I would say I'm a little bit lower on Keenan Allen than I would have been heading into the year, but I also wasn't overly high on him heading in. So, maybe you feel differently. And then for Rome Odunze, I think he should be fine. He was always like a back half of the season upside play, like I talked about with Keenan Allen. Keenan Allen could be a top 2 wide receiver early on. Rome Odunze, as a top prospect, could then come in, kind of overtake him later on in the season. This knee injury he's dealing with does not seem to be serious. I think out of all of these 3, Rome probably takes the smallest hit with Caleb struggling early on, because like I said, he was always a later season option. So as Caleb starts to put it together, we aren't really expecting elite production out of Rome Odunze the first few weeks of the season. So totally fine on Odunze. If you can buy low because he really didn't do anything, I definitely would. Then we have Amari Cooper here. And this is a very strange situation because we're in a spot where the worse Deshaun Watson plays, the worse the situation is going to be for Amari Cooper. But it's if Watson plays so unbelievably bad that he gets benched, then you have Amari Cooper hitting the jackpot with Jameis Winston coming over. So it's are we hoping Deshaun Watson plays well? Are we hoping he plays unbelievably bad? Because if there's some sweet spot where he's just a little bit bad, then that's not going to be good for Amari Cooper. Personally, I think at some point Deshaun Watson's going to get benched. He looks bad. He doesn't even really look like he wants to be out there. And if he does get benched, then Amari Cooper has some real upside when Jameis Winston takes over. On the other hand, if you think that Deshaun Watson is going to play the full 17 games, you don't think he's going to get replaced, then I definitely would be panicking a little bit here on Amari Cooper because the ceiling is just not going to be there with Deshaun Watson playing quarterback. Then we're going to have Diontae Johnson, was targeted 6 times, caught 2 of them for 19 yards. The Panthers offense as a whole looked very rough. I will say, though, from a season-long perspective, I'm really not panicking a ton on Diontae Johnson. After week 1, I was pretty bummed. I liked Diontae. I thought this Panthers offense would take a step forward. But the more I think about it, it's hard for me to believe that this Panthers offense could be worse than they were last year. Bryce Young going into year 2. You have Dave Canales coming in. They upgraded his weapons. They upgraded the offensive line. So even if they're a bad offense, I don't think they're going to be quite as miserable as they were last year. And you look at a dude like Adam Thielen. He was the wide receiver 25 in points per game last year at 33 years old. If Adam Thielen can give you fantasy wide receiver 3 production at that age, at that stage in his career, in that situation, I think Diontae Johnson can definitely pay off as a wide receiver 3. It's kind of where his ADP was, fringe wide receiver 3. I think long-term this season, Diontae Johnson will be just fine. And then the final wide receiver I want to talk about here, Terry McLaurin. He caught 2 passes for 19 yards. Admittedly, I was someone who was not super high on Terry, so I wouldn't really be tanking him in my rest of season rankings because I didn't really have a ton of optimism when it came to his overall upside. I think some people thought this would be the year where Terry finally gets his ceiling unlocked. Maybe Jaden Daniels is the quarterback to finally kind of unlock him here. I don't really think he is. The Commanders were not really looking to push the ball down the field. Daniels was 29th in air yards per attempt. They're not going to be a high volume passing attack. It should get better throughout the season. Daniels gets more confidence. The coaching staff has more confidence in him, lets him air it out a little bit more. But I think his ceiling is probably still a high-end wide receiver 3. So if you really thought he had this elite upside, then maybe I'd be panicking. Just with where I had him, this is kind of not what I was expecting in week 1, but it wasn't overly shocking to me. Now, pivoting over to the running back position, I want to start off by talking about Derrick Henry. And he didn't have the worst fantasy day. I do believe he hit double-digit points, but it does seem like people are concerned about his overall usage. And there are certain players I've talked about, that have not performed well in week 1 that I was pretty high on heading into the year. Derrick Henry was one of those that I feel like I've kind of clocked so far. He's just not game script proof. We've seen it with the Titans, especially last year. If the Ravens are trailing in games, Justice Hill is likely going to outsnap him. He's going to be on the field more because Derrick Henry's not a pass catching back. Justice Hill can do that. The good thing about this situation here with the Ravens, though, is that they're not going to be trailing in very many games. So I don't think that's something you're going to have to worry about. I think it just was like put people on extra panic mode because it was the first game of the season. You draft Derrick Henry, you think he's going to be great, and he's barely on the field, especially in like the second half of that game. The issue I do have with Derrick Henry, along with the fact that he is not game script proof, is just the fact that I don't think he's a super high upside option. Like, I think people thought he would come into the Ravens, they would force feed him 22, 23 carries a game, he would score 20 plus touchdowns and would just dominate. I just don't think that was super realistic for like a 30-year-old running back. The Ravens are not in a situation where they're going to be limping into the playoffs. I don't think they want Derrick Henry to be dust by the time we get to the end of the year. He's not catching passes, so I think he'll have a fine workload on the ground. I don't know if it's going to be 20 plus carries a game. I think he'll do fine in the touchdown department, but the receiving production is not going to be there. So I think he'll be fine. If you drafted him in like the second round, I don't really think he's paying off there. Maybe I'd be a little bit worried if that was the expectation. But if you took him round 3, which most people probably didn't, he's pretty much a round 2 pick in most leagues. But I think rest of season, he's more of like back end RB1, high to mid tier RB2 play. Like, I feel like that's where he's going to settle in, which like is fine. But if you were expecting like top 3 running back production, I just don't think he's going to get it based on what his role is going to be. Moving over to DeAndre Swift, he did not have a great fantasy day, but the usage really was not that bad. He had a 69% snap share, 61% raw participation. He took 10 of these 16 running back carries. Like I talked about earlier on, I do think this Bears offense is going to get better. And if this usage does stick moving forward, I do think he's going to pay off. It's like that fringe RB2 area, which is where he was drafted in most leagues. Another guy who is kind of in that similar range, maybe going a little bit later, Zamir White. And I would say that the panic meter is pretty high for Zamir White. He looks to be, very game script dependent, and needing like a super competitive or winning game script when you're on a bad team is a pretty tough spot to be in here. We saw against the Chargers, who, might be a solid team moving forward, but I don't think they were a world beater. The spread was pretty close in this game. Madison outsnapped Zamir White 36-23. Zamir White only had a 25% raw participation. He had 13 carries for 44 yards. He just has such a low weekly floor. I do think there's real reason to be worried here. And if you were drafting him, to be in your starting lineup or be your flex option, and you have to be worried about like the Raiders staying competitive in certain matchups, that's not a great spot to be in here. So I will say I'm decently worried about Zamir White moving forward. Another guy I'm pretty worried about here is going to be Raheem Mostert. I know a lot of people were not high on Achane. I had Achane as my running back 5. Almost every comment in like my running back rankings video or like must draft video was that I had Achane ranked so high. Raheem Mostert is the running back 1. And I wasn't out on Raheem Mostert, but there were just so many people that were so adamant that Raheem Mostert was still going to lead this backfield. Week 1, we saw Devon Achane lead all these Dolphins running backs in snaps, routes run, carries, and targets across the board. Devon Achane dominated, and he also took both of the goal line carries, which is a massive L for Raheem Mostert moving forward. Now you have Raheem Mostert, who is injured. He is out of the Thursday night game. And when you have a 32-year-old running back that is injured and you draft a young, fun running back in Jaylen Warren, in this year's draft, now Jaylen Warren has the opportunity to earn his role in a similar way that Devon Achane did last year when they had injuries early on, to a guy like Jeff Wilson, who is now back in the mix here. So this was always the risk when you draft a 32-year-old running back. The fall off could happen at any point. An injury has now opened up the opportunity for Jaylen Warren. So I would be very concerned if I did draft Raheem Mostert. And even if Mostert stayed healthy and was playing this week, the fact that he is not leading in carries and that he is not getting the goal line work, that is a massive, massive red flag for him. So it's not only the injury, it was also just the usage was not really favoring him. Then we have Javonte Williams. And this Broncos backfield was always kind of up in the air. You had, Samaje Perine, who they released. You had Audric Estime coming in as a rookie. And then you had Jaleel McLaughlin. And the way that I was viewing this backfield was I was expecting a, bounce back here for Javonte, a full season removed from the torn ACL. I thought he'd lead the backfield. You would get maybe Audric Estime working in on early downs. Jaleel McLaughlin kind of getting unique, fun usage where he can be explosive. We actually saw Jaleel McLaughlin lead this team in carries and targets, which is rough. I guess on a positive note, he really didn't do a ton with it. And then we also have Audric Estime, who's being put on IR. So I don't think Javonte is buried in this backfield. No one really did anything, but he was being drafted as if he was going to lead this backfield. Even if it wasn't a workhorse role, that's kind of where he was priced in. So I guess I'd say I'm a little bit worried, but I'm not totally freaking out. If, McLaughlin came in, led in those areas, and had a great game, then I would be very concerned. But I think Javonte will be fine if he can just, pick up his play moving forward. Then we have Jaylen Warren, and his usage is kind of tough to break down here because he saw 2 carries, 2 targets, compared to Najee Harris's 20 carries and 2 targets. That was pretty shocking usage, just considering how competitive this committee was last year, and the fact by every metric, Jaylen Warren is just a very, very good running back. So realistically, there is no reason that he should be out carried 20-2 by Najee Harris. So the question now is, was this an Arthur Smith thing where we're going to be banging our head against the wall with Jaylen Warren because he's not playing him, because his usage is all over the place? Or was this Jaylen Warren kind of being eased back into the offense, coming off an injury throughout the preseason training camp? It's probably somewhere in the middle. I do think Jaylen Warren is going to see his usage increase, but I do think at this point we have to assume that Arthur Smith heavily favors Najee Harris in this backfield, and it's probably not going to be all that close to a 50-50 split, at least early on in the season, before Jaylen Warren can kind of, earn his opportunities back. So I think it's a tough pill to swallow. I know me personally, in certain leagues, platforms, I think Sleeper specifically, maybe ESPN also, Jaylen Warren was kind of slipping in drafts. So if I was going 0 RB, hero RB, he was definitely someone I was looking to snag as my running back 2, running back 3. He was in my starting lineups in week 1, and I'm not feeling great about some of my running back rooms if he is not going to be playable. So it's a tough pill to swallow. We just have to hope here that he can start to earn his role back. Then we have Chase Brown, and Chase Brown, the usage was not good. Zach Moss led in snaps, routes, carries, and targets. Zach Moss also took pretty much all of the valuable touches, all of the valuable opportunities. This was not a situation where Zach Moss was getting the goal line carries, which was expected, and then the early down work, and Chase Brown was third downs, 2-minute drill. Zach Moss took the 1 goal line snap. He played all 3 2-minute drill snaps, and he also dominated the third downs. So Chase Brown is getting RB2 usage, and he's not even working his way in on any of the fun opportunities. So he's definitely still rosterable. He's young. He could still, force this into a fairly competitive committee, and he also has handcuff upside. But as of right now, he is not playable at the early part of the season, which is disappointing. And so panic, I think, is kind of fair for Chase Brown. I guess a somewhat similar situation with Tyjae Spears and Tony Pollard. I think a lot of people, including myself, expected a close committee between these two. Pollard was the clear running back 1, if we're looking at week 1. Spears ran 4 more routes than Tony Pollard, but Pollard out-carried him 16-4. So Tyjae Spears, similar to Chase Brown, not playable at this point. Is he dead in the water? No. I mean, he was still fine in his opportunities. He could earn a bigger role, but not great if you were expecting him to be serviceable as an RB2 or a flex option early on in the season. And then the final position here, the quarterbacks, just wanted to talk about 2 guys here. The first one is going to be Joe Burrow. He had a rough week 1, 8.1 fantasy points. I think some people are overly concerned about Joe Burrow because they have PTSD with what happened to him last year, where he had the really rough start dealing with the calf injury. I'm not super worried here about Joe Burrow. T. Higgins was out. Jamar Chase played, but he had been holding out. He was also apparently sick. So it just wasn't a great offensive situation, all around him here in week 1. And even within this game, he actually had back-to-back plays, or at least within the same drive, where he threw a touchdown to Mike Gesicki that got called back, should have been caught. And then either a play or 2 later, the tight end, I think it was Tanner Hudson, fumbled on the goal line. So he got robbed of a touchdown there, multiple on the same drive. I think he'll be fine. And then the other guy, Caleb Williams, who I've already kind of talked about it a couple times in this video. I thought he would come in, play well right away. He had the weapons, great prospect. That was not the case. 14 of 29 for 93 passing yards. This is just a spot where I'm willing to bet on the elite quarterback prospect, playing with top weapons, turning it around. It's just not all that complicated to me. I think he'll be fine. Is he playable here in week 2? Personally, I wouldn't want to. I thought he would be playable coming into the year, but I do think he'll figure it out. If he's on waivers, you've got people rostering quarterback 2s. I don't think it's terrible to scoop him up, or someone's just going to give him away for free. So I think these quarterbacks will be fine. Overall, I'd say most of these players should be decent moving forward. I do think the larger concerns are just the usage things. So if guys aren't playing the roles we thought they were going to play heading into the year, that's concerning. If offenses as a whole are going to be bad, that's also concerning. So let me know your thoughts down below. If you enjoyed, hit that like button, subscribe, Any comments, questions, would love to hear them. Thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.